Narvik, a Norwegian port deep inside the Arctic Circle. All around, a world of barren mountains. Hardly any of the seamen whose ships dock here have any idea of the dramatic events which once shook Narvik. Yet at the bottom of the fjord, there still lies evidence of a story that has almost been forgotten. The war in the Arctic began in the Austrian Alps. It was here that Hitler's mountain infantry trained to fight in snow and ice and steep terrain. In the spring of 1940, some of the mountain battalions received secret marching orders. In an operation lasting many days, trains from all over Germany transported troops and equipment to the ports on the country's North Sea coast. It's the morning of April the 7th, 1940. Many of the men had never seen the sea before.
We knew we were part of some operation, but we had no idea exactly what was involved.
Europe had been at war since September 1939. Now a new chapter was being opened with a secret operation known as the Weser Exercise. Adolf Hitler thought the British were planning to occupy Norway. To forestall them, he decided to mount a surprise attack. Overall command for it was given to General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst. This was to be a combined operation involving the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. The objective of this previously untried strategy was to occupy the Norwegian coast at numerous points up to and deep inside the Arctic Circle. It was an undertaking fraught with risk.
Dann wurde uns mitgeteilt,
we were told we were heading north. In the event of being taken prisoner in a naval engagement, we were to say that we were making for Iceland.
At the time, the fleet that assembled off the German coast was the biggest of the war. Offering virtually no resistance, Denmark was occupied within a few hours. April the 9th, shortly after midnight, led by the heavy cruiser Blücher, a group of ships stole into the Oslo fjord, but the Norwegians were on the alert. They extinguished the beacons along the shore, making it difficult for the ships to navigate. Then, a few miles from Oslo, the commander of the Oscarsborg fortress set his sights on the enemy vessels. At 6:32 a.m., two torpedoes fired from the fortress struck the Blücher from short range. The battle cruiser sank, taking 830 men down with her. The German Luftwaffe responded to the loss of the Blücher by bombing the fortress, enabling the other ships to advance on Oslo. Alarmed by the fighting, the government and the royal family fled. Norway saw itself as a neutral state. But, since he was married to a British princess, King Haakon felt a commitment towards Britain. The engagement in the Oslo fjord didn't hold up the Germans for very long. Within a few hours, they had occupied the Norwegian capital. Uncertainty spread. Many people fled, and not only from the Germans. There was talk of a British counterattack on Oslo, but that proved to be just a rumour. The city remained in German hands. At the same time, German destroyers and cruisers were heading towards the Arctic Circle with more than 2,000 mountain infantrymen. Total radio silence was maintained.
Major Stoutner said men were going to Narvik, but that could have been anywhere. At the time, none of us had the slightest idea where Narvik was, but we certainly knew later.
Narvik was one of Hitler's main strategic targets in the north. After the long winter, the little town on the Ofotfjord was slumbering peacefully and unsuspectingly in the early spring sunshine. As usual, people went to work in the port or in offices. Hardly anyone had radio.
When norsk soldat kom in,
a Norwegian soldier came to our house and told us that the Germans had attacked. He said they'd also landed in Oslo and at several other places. That was the first we had heard of it. I remember my mother saying, "They're attacking. Is there no one who can help Norway?"
Det ingen som kan hjelpe Norge?
An ice-free port all year round, Narvik was used for shipping iron ore from Sweden. The raw material came by rail from Kiruna, 180 kilometers away. Germany's steelworks obtained nearly half their iron ore from deposits in Kiruna. Britain also met 10% of its ore needs with imports from northern Sweden. Iron meant steel, and with it tanks, ships and guns. Without guaranteed supplies of Swedish ore, Germany would have been unable to wage war for more than 12 months. So Hitler needed Narvik and the ore railway for his plans. He wanted to secure the raw material for himself and at the same time deprive the British of it. On this particular morning, out in the Arctic Ocean, the German destroyers were battling against seas even their crews had never seen before. No weather report had warned them of a storm of such ferocity.
You can't imagine how fast the weather can change. The destroyer, they told me, was leaning from side to side at an angle of 52 degrees. Sometimes I thought it would never right itself. All the guns the mountain infantry had brought with them had gone overboard. I threw the last few parts overboard myself. If anyone went overboard, we were told, no attempt would be made to rescue them. The storm reached gale force 11. 12 is the maximum. Even the sailors had never experienced anything like it. No one ventures out in seas like that. In all, we lost 9 men on the voyage. Everybody was seasick. In addition to the water that gushed in, there was all the vomit we'd thrown up. The slop flowed to one side and the troops slid into it. Then the vessel would lead in the opposite direction and they'd slide into the mess on the other side. It was awful.
Despite the storm, around 4 a.m. on April the 9th, the 10 destroyers reached the Ofotfjord. After sinking 2 obsolete Norwegian warships, they encountered no further resistance. The mountain troops landed unhindered.
When their feet touched solid ground, the men ran like rabbits. "We'll never set foot on a ship again," they said. "We'd rather walk home."
None of the soldiers that April morning dreamt that they'd remain inside the Arctic Circle for many years. The commander-in-chief of the landing force, Major General Edvard Dietl, persuaded the commandant of Narvik to ignore King Haakon's order and surrender the town without a fight. The commandant was a supporter of the Norwegian Fascist Party, National Samling. General Dietl had had close ties with Adolf Hitler ever since 1920, joining the NSDAP in the year it was founded. His common touch made Dietl popular with his troops. The German units occupied the town, coming into contact with its inhabitants for the first time. There were curious looks on both sides.
On April the 9th, we were standing in front of our house when I saw the first column of German soldiers approaching.
I samme hus som jeg bodde.
Living in the same house as me was a girl who was slightly older. She often ate in the restaurant. She was standing next to me and suddenly became quite hysterical. It seems that 2 days previously she'd been to the restaurant with the officer in charge of the troops. He told her he was the bosun on one of the freighters in the harbour.
Da heter det at han var første styrmann ombord I en av båtene på havna. Men den dagen kom han I.
And now here he was in uniform, a German officer.
Opplevelse av tyske soldater.
Weeks before, Hitler had sent merchant ships to Norway as Trojan horses. Besides soldiers in civilian clothes, on board were fuel and ammunition. General Dietl disarmed the Norwegian garrison and sent the men home. Then he requisitioned public buildings as accommodation for his mountain infantry.
We were billeted in the school. When we lay down, each of us had his head under a bench. When I looked up at the underside of my bench, I saw this metal plate bearing the name of an Austrian firm. The benches in the school had been made by a company in Vienna. We were surprised to see that the Jan Velem, a whaling mothership, had anchored in the middle of the port. We were the first to go alongside to replenish our oil supplies.
But the couplings on the Jan Velem, a supply tanker, didn't fit the oil pipes on the warships. Despite otherwise perfect preparation, this was a catastrophic slip-up. Refueling took hours longer than it should have. There was no way the flotilla could head for home the same day. The German destroyers were trapped. The weather deteriorated, and the British were already on their way to mount a counterattack. It was the morning of April the 10th.
Det var nærmest snøstorm.
It was snowing. In fact, there was almost a snowstorm blowing. The snow was moist and heavy. You couldn't see a thing, but you could hear a lot. In fact, early in the morning, we were woken up by the sound of shells being fired, but I couldn't see any warships.
It
was about 5 or 10 to 6. The veil of mist parted as if someone had drawn back a curtain. To the right of us, we saw the sun rising in the sky and the mountains. And on the fjord, suddenly emerging from the driving snow, were 5 enemy destroyers.
That morning, the British turned the ore port of Narvik into a giant ship's graveyard. The German Navy suffered serious losses, but the destroyers managed to repulse the Royal Navy for a while. Many of Narvik's inhabitants fled, including 12-year-old Harry Hjelle and his parents. The family owned a hut on the other side of the fjord. Thousands now forced their way into a settlement that normally housed just 70. A disaster was impending.
Med ett ord mat. Det var det största
problemet. The biggest problem was food. The little ones cried because they were always hungry. We older children were able to handle the situation better because we knew that there simply wasn't anything to eat. But the infants cried and cried and cried.
Far min og
On April the 10th, my father and 2 other men decided to go back into town to fetch bedding and as much food as they could find.
They never returned.
I realized that now I was the man in the family.
The next day, the British reappeared off Narvik, an overwhelming force of 9 destroyers and a battleship. The engagement shifted to the Rombaksfjord. Badly damaged, almost out of ammunition, and having suffered serious losses, the 4 remaining German warships fled to the end of the fjord. Their commanders took a momentous decision. They ran their vessels aground, and in doing so, saved the lives of many crew members. sailor Alfred Eichholz also lost his ship.
The captain gave the order to hold on tight. He was going to beach the ship. We were lying at right angles to the fjord. The engine started up and we ran aground on the rocks.
The Georg Thiele fired its last torpedo to cover the flight of the other warships. The destroyer broke up and burnt out, but it didn't sink.
I ran to look at the spot where I'd been standing with the ship's engineer and my other shipmates. I saw that they'd been hit by the blast from a shell. They were all lying there with their insides torn out. I couldn't bring myself to step over them. So I inflated my life jacket near the propeller's protective armor and jumped overboard. The commander said, "Eichholz, up above us is the railway line. That's where we'll assemble." It was the first I'd heard of a railway line there.
It was the Ore Line. There, the 2,600 sailors who'd survived encountered mountain troops who'd pulled back into the mountains from their positions in and around Narvik. They were attacked by Norwegian troops who were loyal to their king and knew all about fighting in the mountains of the Arctic. The Germans had only light arms with which to defend themselves, and there was no prospect of any reinforcements arriving.
At first, our North group, the Windisch group, only faced Norwegians. Then came the landing on the 10th or 12th of May.
24,000 Allied troops went ashore around Narvik. They outnumbered the Germans 5 to 1.
There were British, French and Polish troops, and soldiers from the Foreign Legion.
The Germans were pushed back. Their position seemed hopeless. The Germans were trapped. All they could do was withdraw higher and higher into the mountains, towards the Swedish border. Then, unexpectedly, the Luftwaffe came to their aid.
All of a sudden, 12 Junker 52s appeared and landed on the lake. There was so much snow that one of them stood on its nose. We unloaded everything on board. We collected all the fuel the planes had left, so that at least one of them could take off again. The others remained on the lake.
With great effort, the mountain troops brought their new heavy arms into position. But even they made only minimal difference. To reinforce General Dietl's units, paratroopers were dropped near Björnfjell, the last railway station before the Swedish border. They had all volunteered to fight on the Narvik front, but in the final analysis, even the paratroopers could make little impact on the hopeless situation in which the encircled Germans found themselves. It was only a question of time, it seemed, before they'd have to surrender. Dietl knew this, but he ordered his men to hold out to the last man. In a top-secret message, Hitler gave his general permission, if necessary, to cross into neutral Sweden. Unofficially, preparations were made for the mountain troops and the sailors to be interned. Trains were organized and made ready on the Swedish side of the border.
We spent 64 days up there. Then we heard that the British were withdrawing. We had no idea why, but it was because we'd invaded France.
The Allies pulled out of Norway because the Germans had attacked France, and all their forces were needed in that theatre. Dietl's soldiers moved back into a Narvik that had suffered total destruction.
I must confess that I stole a pair of shoes from a shop. The soles on my boots were so worn that I couldn't walk in them anymore.
When the flag with the swastika was hoisted over Narvik, the whole of Norway capitulated. King Haakon and his family fled from Tromsø to exile in London. From there, they organized resistance against the German occupation. In Germany, Hitler's propaganda machine euphorically acclaimed General Dietl and the sailors from the sunken destroyers as the heroes of Narvik. The Führer received Dietl on the Obersalzberg, conferring the highest military honors on him and promoting him to General of the Mountain Infantry. In Norway, a period of political upheaval began. Apart from the Nationalsamling, all political parties were banned. The leader of the Norwegian Nazi movement, Vidkun Quisling, used the German invasion to place himself at the head of a government. But Hitler, who didn't trust Quisling, replaced him, appointing the former Gauleiter of Essen, Josef Terboven, Commissar of Norway. People tried to come to terms with the new situation as best they could.
Ja, min far
My father ran a grocery store, and the Germans soon got in touch with him about supplies. We never discussed politics or Hitler or anything like that. The Germans were very disciplined, especially the soldiers. The airmen weren't quite as disciplined, while the sailors were perhaps even less disciplined.
Oysand, south of Trondheim. This hamlet too was occupied by the Germans, but by special units. Military geologists and surveyors, they embarked on a secret project. The plan was to build a completely new town, New Trondheim. It would be the most northerly city in the future Great Germanic Empire, a national socialist utopia at a strategically important location. Many myths surround this Nazi plan even today. For a long time, not a scrap of evidence could be found. Yet the loft in this house contains the survey and development plans, along with extensive correspondence between Kommissar Josef Terboven and Albert Speer. Hitler's architect Speer had been given the task of designing New Trondheim, a city for 250,000 people. The site was developed and work got underway on the first phase. An airfield was built by construction teams belonging to the Todt organization, as it was known. Workers levelled the site, laid wooden planks for the runway, and built hangars for the aircraft. Work also began on a dry dock for the Tirpitz. The German Navy had based the world's biggest battleship in Norway, planning to have it serviced and repaired in the harbour at New Trondheim. But the construction work dragged on. In the end, the course taken by the war meant the plans for New Trondheim had to be shelved. In many places in Norway, the Germans set prisoners of war to work. There is no official film record of this. These amateur pictures were taken by a soldier. The prisoners of war, who came from all over Europe, lived in camps in appalling conditions. They built roads, railways, bridges, ports, and submarine bunkers. Often, the projects were grandiose.
They were a sorry sight. They were all undernourished, and some perhaps were ill as well. All they wanted was food.
Mat. Det var en brot.
In camps in the far north, a long way from home, thousands died as a result of the terrible conditions in which they had to slave for Hitler's Germany.
Vi saw
We saw 4 men carrying a stretcher. a primitive brown stretcher with several bodies on it, wrapped in sacks. We could just see a few hands and feet sticking out.
During the German occupation, billions of Reichsmarks were invested in developing the economy. Money the Norwegians had to provide. But the planned production levels of iron ore, iron pyrites, carbide and copper matte were never attained. The Norwegians themselves made sure of that. They deliberately drove galleries in the wrong direction so that output remained low. The attitude of most Norwegians towards the occupying forces was one of rejection.
Det var tyskarna som drev arbetslivet.
It was the Germans who drove the economy. This included forestry, as well as road, barracks and bunker construction. As I remember it, people who worked for the Germans used to talk of sabotage whenever they were slow or lazy or did sloppy work. That sort of behavior was regarded as sport.
Uppföra sig på den måten.
But it was dangerous. In Norway, too, the Gestapo acted with German precision, using informers and careerists, as well as nominal and deeply committed members of the Nationalsamling movement.
One morning, I went to school knowing that during the night, someone had been shot. The son of the man who'd been killed was at school, and we offered him our condolences. But the boy hadn't been told what had happened. He was so shocked that he fainted.
Soon, fear began to spread. Resistance only took place clandestinely in small groups. The security machine was too efficient, the power of the occupying forces ever present. Gabriel Brovold's father did good business with the Germans from which both sides profited. Nevertheless, one day he was warned that he and his family were in grave danger.
That particular day, we were at home. My father told us that his friend Quelmo had given him a warning. His name, he said, was next on the list of those to be shot as hostages. My father was distraught at the news and decided to escape. And so, in February or March 1943, we fled.
In fleeing to Sweden, the Brovold family escaped the fate of other Norwegians who, like here in Trondheim, were shot by the SS, selected as hostages seemingly at random, and punished for unsolved acts of sabotage. It took the Germans several months to occupy the whole of Norway. The Arctic Circle, a place for photographs to be shown and marvelled at back home. Look, I was there where the Arctic begins. Travelling on foot or by ship, by autumn 1940, the Germans had finally reached the extreme north, the province of Finnmark. Through to spring 1941, here too in the remoteness of the Arctic, more and more troops were concentrated in Kirkenes, in Svanvik and in Neiden.
De første tyske tropper, den kom ikke hit til
The first German troops to arrive here came on June the 4th, 1940. They requisitioned school buildings and used them as garrisons. They billeted themselves in assembly rooms and other places. The Germans also requisitioned private homes. In doing so, they intruded on the lives of the civilian population. A family of 5, 6 or 7 people would have to make their living room available to a German officer.
Offiseren fikk stua.
Vi oppdaget fort at Tyskland hadde mye godteri.
We soon noticed that the Germans had lots of sweets and chocolate with them. Their fruit drops in particular had this wonderful smell. Every day, whenever we saw German soldiers, we children would ask them if they had any sweets for us. We'd never tasted anything like it. Those sweets were really tempting. Even today, people still go to kiosks looking for that same smell and flavor.
But other memories of the SS are less pleasant.
Følte nok hat når de tok far.
When I learned they'd arrested my father, I was filled with hate. I got home in the evening a little bit late. They've taken Papa, my mother told me. I wondered what on earth he could have done. He wasn't interested in politics, and he certainly wasn't a communist. But he wasn't the only one they arrested. They detained men all over Pasvik.
De arresterte mange menn I hele Pasvik.
The worst thing was when they went to Mina Lund and told her that Odd Lund had been shot, somewhere between Bjørnevatn and Hasseng. Was in force, and he was out checking on some piglets he planned to buy. He was ordered to stand still, but he didn't, and so they shot him. When the Germans brought the news, all the adults wept.
Det husker jeg, fordi at da skrek alle voksne.
The German soldiers lived their everyday lives in a deceptive peace. The occupation became normality. Elsewhere in Europe, people were dying in their thousands. But for the German soldiers in Norway, Christmas was a time for quiet reflection. The following year, however, 1941, things would be quite different. More and more troops were dispatched to the extreme north. The soldiers' days were filled with exercises of a very special nature. In Neiden, a village on the border with Finland, the school children gazed in amazement at the soldiers' unusual activities.
What impressed me was that they were crossing these watery swamps using huge mats made of brushwood to get horses from one side to the other.
But why were the Germans training to the point of exhaustion, crossing swamps, wading through rivers, and mounting attacks in bare, unprotected terrain? A new chapter in the war in the Arctic was about to be opened.
In Naiden, the orders for the attack on Russia arrived. I had to type them out using one finger and copy them myself. The day the war on Russia began, we crossed the Norwegian border into Finland.
Norwegisch-finnische Grenze überschritten.
In Central Europe, the German army had already invaded Soviet territory, but in the Arctic tundra, the guns were still silent, until June the 29th, 1941.
Siitä oli juttua heti kohtaan siinä vaiheessa, kun saksalaisia tuli.
When the Germans reached Petsamo, rumors began to circulate. People suspected that hostilities would break out again.
Mutta sitten kun meidät kutsuttiin aseisiin,
when we were called up, it was quite clear that we'd be involved in fighting.
Tappelu tulee.
The commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim, entered into an alliance with Hitler's Germany. He wanted to recover territory Finland had lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940. This hope turned the Finns and the Germans into brothers in arms. They shared the front, which stretched for 1,800 kilometers. In the forests along the Soviet border, two armies lay in readiness, equipped with infantry, aircraft and mountain troops.
For 2 weeks before the campaign got underway, we watched the Russians patrolling the border. We were behind a rise, and they couldn't see us. We thought they'd be easy meat for us when the attack began, but they knew this, it seems, because we didn't get a single one of them.
It took only a few days for the mountain infantry in the northern sector to reach the Titovka River. They encountered hardly any resistance. The Red Army had withdrawn almost all its troops from the region. But then the attack foundered. The German advance became bogged down in the mud of the pathless Russian tundra.
Wir wussten nicht, dass zwischen Titovka und Litza.
We had no idea there wasn't a single road between the Titovka and Litza rivers. We saw maps with lines on them, but they just indicated cable links, telephone lines or such. There were no roads.
Aber es gab keinen Weg und keinen Steg.
The Russian port of Murmansk was only 100 kilometers away. The objective was for General Dietl to capture Murmansk before Christmas. But with no roads to travel on, that was verging on the impossible.
Der Angriff hatte das Ziel,
the aim was to cut off Murmansk because it was Russia's only ice-free port. The Russians were receiving all their supplies from America through Murmansk.
Amerika bekam.
Setting out from Liverpool, the first Allied naval convoy bringing food and weapons arrived in Murmansk as early as August 1941. The Soviet Union was dependent on this support in its struggle against Hitler's Germany. 4 months after the attack began, General Dietl's troops had advanced a mere 24 kilometers towards Murmansk. The Red Army dug in, refusing to yield another meter of ground. The Germans were trapped in a hostile environment. The Arctic winter hit the invading troops with undreamt of severity.